The storm came out of Canada with no warning and no apology the way Montana storms always do in the dead of January, sweeping down from the Rockies with a violence that seemed personal, that seemed aimed at anyone stupid enough to be caught on the open highway after dark. Harlan Crow was 53 miles from nowhere when the first wall of it hit him. He felt it before he saw it. That shift in pressure that every rider learns to read after enough years on the road, a sudden drop in the air that tells you something is coming, and that you have approximately 30 seconds to make a decision about your life. He had been making decisions about his life for 42 years. He was 63 years old, and he had been riding with the Hells Angels since Nixon was in the White House. And he had survived things that should not have been survivable. And he was still here, still astride a 2019 Road King in the dead of a Montana winter, leading 3 of his brothers down a highway that was rapidly becoming invisible. He throttled back. The others followed. That was the thing about brothers who had ridden together long enough. You did not need hand signals. You did not need radio. You felt the change in the leader, and you adjusted. And that was all. Knox pulled up on his left, 61 years old, built like a refrigerator someone had taught to ride a motorcycle, with a beard that had gone completely white sometime in the last decade, and hands so scarred from decades of work and weather that they looked like they had been carved from old wood rather than grown. He pointed ahead at a smear of yellow light barely visible through the curtain of snow. A sign, red neon, open. That was enough. They pulled into the gravel lot of Rosie's Diner at 9:43 on a Tuesday night in January, and the gravel was already going to ice beneath their tires. And when Harlan swung off his bike and his boots hit the ground, he felt the particular cold that lives at the bottom of a Montana winter. The cold that is not just temperature, but something older and more indifferent. The cold that does not care whether you live or die, and has never cared. He was 63 years old. His knees announced this fact every morning now. Behind him, Colt killed his engine and climbed off with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had learned to manage the wear and tear of a body that had been ridden hard for 6 decades. Colt was 62, though most people who did not know him well would have put him at older, something about the deep lines around his eyes and the stillness he carried. The stillness of a man who had seen the inside of situations that left marks you could not see from the outside. And then Ryder, the youngest of them at 41, who swung off his bike with an ease that made the older men quietly resent him in the way you resent the young, for possessing something you remember losing. They crossed the lot together. Their boots on the ice-glazed gravel made a sound like something breaking. The bell above the diner door made a thin sound when Harlan pushed it open. Inside, the heat hit him like something physical. The warmth of a place that had been keeping itself against the cold for decades, and had gotten very good at it. The diner was small. Red vinyl booths along the windows. A counter with 8 stools. A jukebox in the corner playing something that sounded like Merle Haggard, but might have been anyone who had ever decided that loss was a reasonable subject for a song. The tiles on the floor were black and white and cracked in several places, and had probably been cracked since before any of the men currently sitting in this diner were born. There were 3 other customers, a trucker at the counter with coffee in front of him, and his eyes focused on nothing in particular, an old couple in the far corner booth sharing a piece of pie, with the comfortable silence of 2 people who have been sharing things for so long that conversation has become optional. Nobody looked up when the 4 bikers came in. Nobody who ate regularly at Rosie's Diner was likely to be alarmed by the sight of men in leather and patches. They took the booth nearest the window where they could see the bikes. 42 years of riding had given Harlan certain habits that had long since passed from choice into reflex. He never sat with his back to a door. He always faced the room. He always kept his bike in his sightline when weather allowed it. These were not paranoia. They were the accumulated wisdom of a man who had spent 4 decades in situations where what you could not see was usually the thing that ended you. He settled into the booth and felt the exhaustion of a man who has been cold for too long. The exhaustion that goes deeper than tired, that settles into the bones and begins to have opinions about your life choices. She appeared from the kitchen doorway before they had finished taking off their gloves. 25, maybe 26. Blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, with the kind of efficiency that suggests someone who has been pulling her hair back for work shifts since she was old enough to hold a job. Her name tag said Sadie. She moved between the tables with the practiced ease of someone who had done this particular dance long enough that the thinking had mostly been removed from the process. She had steady eyes and a face that was pretty in an uncomplicated way, and around those eyes something that Harlan had learned over 63 years to recognize as the tiredness of a person who is holding more than they are showing. "Coffee," she said. It was not a question. "Absolutely," Harlan said. "And keep it coming." We drove through what I believed to be the actual end of the world getting here. She almost smiled. The smile did not quite arrive, but you could see where it would have landed if it had. She brought 4 mugs and filled them from a pot that smelled like it had been brewing since the morning shift began. The coffee was strong and slightly burnt, and at that particular moment it was the best thing Harlan had tasted in recent memory. He wrapped both hands around the mug and let the warmth work its way back into his fingers. She produced a notepad. "You know what you want, or you need a minute," Burger Knox said without looking at the menu. "Rare. Fries." "Same," said Colt. "Make it 4, Harlan said. "And if you have pie that was made today and not sometime last week, we will take that too." She wrote it down. And then she did not leave, which was the thing Harlan noticed. She stood at the edge of the table looking at Knox's hand resting on the surface, specifically at the keychain beside his hand. A Harley-Davidson skull in chrome that Knox had carried for 20 years. The kind of thing that becomes invisible when you carry it long enough. She said, "Is that a Heritage Softail?" All 4 men looked at her. Knox said, "How would you know that?" She said, "The keychain. The skull shape is different on the Heritage than the Softail Slim or the Fat Boy. My dad had one. I grew up knowing the difference." Ryder leaned forward slightly. Knox turned the keychain over in his palm. Colt set his coffee mug down. Harlan watched her. There was something in her face that had shifted, something that had moved from the professional neutrality of a woman working a late shift at a diner towards something more personal, something that lived closer to the surface of her. She said, "He had a Heritage just like yours. Same color. Black with the chrome pipes he added himself. He spent more time in the garage with that bike than he ever spent in the house. I used to bring him sandwiches out there, and sometimes he would not even notice I was standing there until the food was in his hand." "Sounds like a rider," Ryder said. She was quiet for a moment in the way people are quiet when what they want to say is simple. But the simple thing contains something complicated inside it. She said, "He was. He does not ride anymore. Has not in a long time." And then she said, "His name is Silas. Silas Dolan." What happened next happened in the space of approximately 2 seconds, and Harlan would spend a long time afterward trying to reconstruct it, precisely because it seemed important to understand exactly how something could change that fast. His hand opened. The mug hit the table edge and went over. Coffee spread across the vinyl tabletop and dripped to the seat, and Harlan was barely aware of it. Barely aware of anything except the ringing in his ears that had nothing to do with the jukebox and everything to do with those two words. Silas Dolan. Said out loud by a girl in a Montana diner in the middle of a snowstorm who had no idea what those two words weighed. Knox had gone white. Not pale. White. The blood had simply evacuated his face in a single motion. Colt made a sound that was not quite a word, something between a syllable and a breath, something that the body produces when the mind receives information that it is not prepared to process. Ryder looked at the three older men and saw their faces, and understood that something had happened that he did not yet have the information to understand. Sadie stood at the table with the notepad in her hand and watched the four bikers react to her father's name the way you might watch four men react to a gunshot, with that same flinch, that same recalibration. She said, "What? Did I say something?" Harlan found his voice. He did not know where he had found it, but there it was. He said, "What did you say your last name was?" She said, "Dolan. Sadie Dolan." He said, "And your father?" You said, "Silas Dolan." She said, "Yeah. Why?" Harlan looked at Knox. Knox looked at Colt. Colt stared at the table. Harlan said, "Your father rode with us." The way her face changed was something he would also spend time trying to reconstruct later. The professional mask came down first, and what was underneath it was not what you would expect to find in a 25-year-old woman working a diner in Montana in January. What was underneath it was a daughter who had been waiting for something, who had perhaps been waiting for a long time, and who was now confronted with four rough men in Hell's Angels leather, who had gone pale at the sound of her father's name. She said, "You knew him." Harlan said, "We rode with him for more than a decade. He was road captain when he was 34 years old. Best rider any of us had seen up to that point, and I include myself in that assessment." She pulled out the chair at the end of the table and sat down. Her notepad was still in her hand. She had forgotten it was there. She said, "He never talked about it. I knew he had been in a club once. I found the vest in the back of his closet when I was a teenager. Asked him about it, and he said it was from another life." Harlan said, "We need to tell you some things about your father that he would probably not choose to tell you himself." She said, "Okay." It was 2009 when the federal investigation began. Harlan laid it out without dramatics because the facts themselves were dramatic enough, and any elaboration would have been disrespectful to them. The Hells Angels charter in Billings had made certain business decisions in certain periods that were now attracting serious attention from people who had the authority and the motivation to make those decisions very expensive for the men who had made them. RICO charges. Federal weapons conspiracy. The kind of thing that does not end with a fine and a suspension. The kind of thing that ends with a decade minimum for every man whose name appears in the relevant documents. Silas Dolan had been clean, or clean enough. He had stepped back from certain activities 3 years prior when Ruth was first diagnosed, because a man whose wife is facing cancer does not have the attention to spare for the other things. He had done it quietly without fanfare, and what it meant now was that when the feds came, Silas was the only man in the charter with a profile that could absorb the charge without destroying everything around him. He did not have to do it. Nobody asked him to. He made the calculation himself alone over the course of about 48 hours. And then he sat down with Harlan and told him what he was going to do. The charter had made promises. Medical bills, mortgage, everything Ruth needed while Silas was inside. They had kept those promises while he was in Deer Lodge. 3 years, every bill paid, every obligation met. And when Silas Dolan walked out of Deer Lodge prison in March 12 years ago, Ruth had 8 months left. Sadie had gone very still while Harlan talked. Her hands were flat on the table. Her face was doing the work of processing several large things simultaneously, which is hard work, and she was doing it in silence, which made it harder. She said, "He went to prison for all of you." Harlan said he did. She said, "And when he came home, my mom was dying." Harlan said, "Yes." She said, "And you, after she died. Where were you?" The table went quiet. Harlan said, "We were not there the way we should have been." He did not elaborate on this. There was no elaboration that would have improved it. She looked at Harlan for a long moment. Then she looked at the other 3 men in turn, Knox and Colt and Ryder, taking her time with each face, the way a person takes time when they are deciding something. She said, "He is alive. He is 20 minutes from here. He has not left the house in I do not know how long. He does not eat unless I make him. He does not sleep regular hours. He sits in my mother's house surrounded by her things, and he does not seem to understand that he is allowed to still be alive. I have tried everything. Doctors, a counselor he saw twice and then refused to go back. Medication he took for 3 months and then stopped. I have tried everything I know how to try, and I am 25 years old and I do not know very much." She stopped. Then she said, "I think about what happens when I am not there to make him eat. I think about it a lot." Ryder said, "Where is the house?" She wrote the address on a page from her notepad and tore it out and put it on the table in front of Harlan. Then she stood up and smoothed her apron and picked up her notepad. She said, "He might not open the door. If he does open it, he might tell you to leave. He is not who he was. I need you to understand that. The man you rode with is not the man who is in that house." She paused. She said, "But some part of him is still in there. I have to believe that. Otherwise, I do not know why I keep going back." She walked back toward the kitchen. The door swung behind her. The 4 men sat with their coffee and the address on the table between them. Ryder said, "What are we doing?" Harlan picked up the piece of paper and looked at it. He said, "We are going to finish our coffee, and then we are going to that address." He said, "We are not going to discuss whether we should. We are going to go, because there is no alternative. There is no version of this night where we sit in this diner with a piece of paper that has Silas Dolan's address on it and do not go." Knox said he might not want to see us. Harlan said he is going to get the opportunity to tell us that himself. They ate when the food came. The burgers were good, better than the setting suggested they would be. Harlan ate his without tasting it, because his mind was 20 minutes down the road. He left 3 times the cost of the meal on the table when they stood to go. Sadie caught his arm before he reached the door. She said, "Do not make it worse. Whatever else you do, whatever happens, do not make it worse for him. He is already so close to the edge that I cannot tell anymore how far he has to fall." Harlan put his hand over hers for a moment. He said, "We are not here to break anything. We are here because we owe him something we cannot pay back, and we are going to at least try. Outside, the storm had eased from active violence into the kind of cold that simply commits to itself. Their bikes were coated in frost. They scraped enough of it away to ride and pulled out of the lot in single file and drove 20 minutes east on a road that had the quality of being already abandoned for the night. No other headlights, no other signs of anyone else choosing to be out in this weather. The house was on Callahan Street, in a neighborhood that had once been working class and had since shaded into something more complicated. A neighborhood where pride of ownership was distributed unevenly, where some houses were maintained with evident care, and others were in various stages of losing the argument with time. The house at the address Sadie had written was white with green shutters. It had been white once. The paint was peeling now in long strips from the porch posts, and the shutters hung at slightly wrong angles as though the house had slowly exhaled over the years and never quite finished. The lawn was overgrown ghost grass, bent flat under the weight of new snow. There was a light on somewhere in the back. The rest of the house was dark. In the driveway sat a pickup truck with 6 months of grime on the windshield. It had not moved in long enough that the tires had flattened slightly against the concrete. They pulled to the curb and killed their engines and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. Harlan swung off his bike. The others followed. They walked up the front path together. 4 men whose boots left tracks in the fresh snow. 4 men who, in 42 years of combined riding, had stood in front of things considerably more frightening than a dark house in January, and who were, nevertheless, not finding this easy. The porch steps groaned under their weight. In the corner of the porch, a rocking chair had accumulated enough snow to suggest it had not been used since before the first snowfall of the season. A hanging plant bracket held nothing. The hook was still there. The plant was not. Harlan raised his hand and knocked. The sound of it went into the house and seemed to disappear. He waited. He knocked again. Harder this time. The cold was working through his jacket and his hands, and he could feel the beginning of the pain that cold produces in old joints. He said, "Silas. Silas Dolan. It is Harlan Crow. Open the door." Nothing. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, barely audible through the walls, the sound of movement. Slow. Deliberate. The movement of someone who has not been in any hurry to do anything in a long time. The door opened 6 inches and stopped. A chain lock. The old kind, brass heavy, the kind that people installed in the 70s and never took down. And in the gap lit from somewhere behind by a light Harlan could not see the source of was Silas Dolan. He had been a large man once. The kind of large that comes from actual physical work over many years, from decades of riding and wrenching and living with the kind of physicality that a club life requires. Harlan remembered him as taking up space in a particular way. Not just physical space, but some other kind. The way certain people expand into a room when they walk into it. The man in the doorway had lost that. He had lost perhaps 40 pounds from a frame that had not been designed to lose 40 pounds. And the result was something that suggested, rather than described, the man he had been. His hair was gray and had grown past his shoulders and hung there without any apparent intention behind it. He was wearing sweatpants and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, and his feet were in the kind of socks you buy in multi-packs and wear until they give out. But the eyes were still Silas Dolan's eyes, dark and sharp and containing something that was not entirely extinguished. something that had perhaps retreated to the very back of the room, but had not yet left the building. What they contained in this particular moment, looking through a 6-inch gap at Harlan Crow, and what could be seen of the men behind him, was a mixture of things that Harlan needed a moment to identify. Anger. Yes, old anger that had been kept somewhere cool and dry where it would not spoil. Pain. The kind that does not announce itself because it has become so constant that announcing it would require announcing it every moment of every day. And that is simply not practical. And something else. Something that Harlan almost did not recognize because he had not seen it in Silas Dolan's face before and did not expect to see it there. A tiredness so complete that it had moved past the category of tired and into something that had no good name in common language. He said, "What do you want?" His voice was rough from disuse. The kind of rough that comes from a man who has not had extended conversations recently and whose vocal cords have begun to operate more in the register of a suggestion than a certainty. Harlan said, "We met your daughter tonight at Rosie's. She served us coffee and told us who her father was, and we came." Something crossed Silas's face. Something that might have been fear if fear were the right word, which it was not quite. He said, "Sadie has nothing to do with you." Harlan said, "She has everything to do with us whether she knows it or not. She is the daughter of a man who did 3 years in Deer Lodge for this club, and we have not checked on him in 15 years, and that makes her very much our concern." Long silence. Silas said, 15 years. That is the word you are using for it. Concern. Harlan said, "I know what it sounds like." Silas said, "It sounds like a man who drove 20 minutes in a snowstorm to feel better about himself." Harlan said, "Maybe. I am not going to tell you my motives are simple, but I am also not going to stand on your porch in this cold and have this argument through a 6-inch gap. So either let us in or tell us to leave. But say it to my face." The chain rattled. It was a particular sound, small and metallic and absolutely ordinary, and yet Harlan would remember it for a long time because of what it meant. The chain going slack and the door swinging inward was Silas Dolan making a choice that he had probably been fighting with himself about since he heard the knock. He stepped back. He did not say, "Come in." He simply moved away from the door and left the doorway empty. And Harlan understood that for Silas Dolan, in the state he was in, that was as much of an invitation as he was capable of. They went inside. The smell hit Harlan first. Not unclean. Nothing so simple as that. The smell of a closed space that had been breathing its own air for too long. The smell of a house where the windows had not been opened in months. Beneath that, something else. Something that was neither food nor absence of food, but something between the two. The smell of a kitchen where meals are prepared only when absolutely necessary and eaten without ceremony. And beneath all of that, something that was harder to name. Something floral and faint and completely out of place in the winter dark of a house like this. He could not identify it immediately, and then he could. It was the smell of a candle that had been burning recently. The specific, waxy, floral smell of scented candles. The kind that fill a room with the suggestion of roses or lavender or vanilla. He stood in the front room and looked at it. This was not a man's room. Or it had not been. Not entirely, not even after 12 years of a man living in it alone. The furniture was arranged with a care that men living alone rarely apply to furniture arrangement. The throw pillows on the couch were positioned with intention. The curtains were drawn, but they were curtains that someone had chosen rather than hung a particular blue faded now, but clearly once deliberate. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, photographs. Many photographs. A wedding photograph where a young Silas Dolan in a suit that did not quite know what to do with his shoulders stood beside a woman with a laugh that was visible even in still photography. A photograph of the two of them on a motorcycle somewhere that looked like summer. A photograph of a child, a girl in pigtails who would grow up to be the woman currently serving coffee 20 minutes west. There were other things. A woman's reading glasses on the side table beside the couch. A coffee mug with a pattern of blue flowers that had been positioned with exactness on a coaster. A book face down, the spine up as though put down by a reader who expected to return to it. The book was 12 years old. The reading glasses were 12 years old. The mug was 12 years old. Nothing in this room had moved in 12 years. Silas stood in the middle of the room with his arms crossed and his feet planted, and the expression of a man who has let people into a place that was not meant for visitors, and is already regretting it, and is doing his best to manage what happens next. He said, "I do not have anything to offer you. There is no food in the house worth eating." Knox said, "We ate at the diner. We are fine." He said, "Then say what you came to say." Harlan sat down in the chair across from the couch without being invited. The others distributed themselves around the room. Colt on the far end of the couch, Ryder near the window. Knox staying near the door in the way that Knox always stayed near the door in new spaces. Harlan said, "We should have come 15 years ago, 12 years ago when Ruth died. We should have been at the funeral and we should have stayed after. And we should have been here when you needed people and we were not. And I am not going to tell you. There is an explanation for that because there is not. There is only the fact of it." Silas looked at him for a long moment. He said, "You want to know the worst part? I kept waiting. For months after Ruth died, I kept telling myself they will come. They are giving me time. That is what brothers do. They give you time. So I waited, and then the months kept coming and nobody came. And eventually I stopped waiting, but by then I had already forgotten how to want people around." Colt said, "We told ourselves you needed space, that you wanted to be alone, that you had signaled that you wanted us to stay away." Silas said, "I had just buried my wife." Colt said, "I know." Silas said, "A man who has just buried his wife should not have to signal that he needs his brothers. His brothers should simply be there. That is the point of brothers." Nobody argued with this. Harlan said, "You are right. There is no argument. We failed you." Silas moved to the window and stood with his back to them, looking at whatever could be seen of the street through the gap at the edge of the curtains. Outside, the snow was continuing its business. The bikes were accumulating white on their seats and tanks. Harlan said, "Silas, I need to ask you about the Harley." A pause, long enough that Harlan began to wonder if Silas had heard him. He said, "What about it?" Harlan said, "Your daughter thinks it is in the garage. She said you keep it under a tarp." The silence that followed this was different from the silences that had preceded it. Those silences had been the silences of a man choosing his words. This silence was the silence of a man who had been found out. Silas turned from the window. He said, "I sold it 8 years ago. Needed the money for something. I do not remember what. A bill. Something that needed paying. I sold it to a man in Billings for half of what it was worth, because I needed the money quickly and because." He stopped. Harlan said, "Because what?" He said, "Because every time I looked at it, I could hear her. On the back. She used to sit right behind me and hold on, and sometimes when we were going fast enough, she would take her hands away from my waist and put her arms straight out to the sides like she was flying. Said she could hear the wind better that way. Said the wind told her things. He said it the way you say something you have not said aloud before carefully, like moving a piece of furniture that has been in the same place for years, and you are not entirely sure what is underneath it. He said Sadie does not know. I could not tell her. Could not explain to my own daughter that I had sold the one thing that used to make me feel like I was still myself. So I left the garage closed, and I let her believe the bike was in there. And every time she asks about it, I change the subject. He said, the garage has been empty for 8 years. Knox and Colt and Ryder looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at Silas. What he was hearing was not the story of a man who had sold a motorcycle. What he was hearing was the story of a man who had sold the last piece of the person he used to be, and had then locked the door on the empty space, and had been living adjacent to that emptiness ever since, knowing it was there, knowing what it meant. Not willing to look at it directly, Harlan said, "Then we will get you another one." Silas turned back toward the window. He said, "It is not about the bike." Harlan said, "I know it is not about the bike." And then Colt stood up. He did it quietly, and he crossed the room to the kitchen doorway and stopped there. He had the quality of stillness that comes over a man when he has seen something that he does not want to react to in front of other people. He turned back to the room. He caught Harlan's eye. His face said something that his mouth did not. His face said, "We have a problem." His face said, "This is worse than I understood 5 minutes ago." His face said, "Come here." Harlan stood and walked to the kitchen doorway, and Colt stepped aside to let him see. The kitchen was small and clean in the way of a kitchen that is not used much and has therefore stayed clean by virtue of vacancy. There was a plate in the drying rack that had been washed and not put away. There was a coffee maker that was the only appliance on the counter. There was the calendar on the wall stopped at November, which had been the month Harlan knew of Ruth's death 12 years prior. And there was the drawer. It was the second drawer from the left beside the sink. It was open approximately 4 inches. Colt had found a spoon somewhere and left the drawer the way he found it, slightly open, in the way that kitchen drawers sometimes catch and do not close fully. Harlan could see inside from where he stood. He saw a handgun, compact, semi-automatic, and from the particular angle of it in the drawer, positioned in the way that a man positions something he intends to be able to find quickly and without fumbling. The way you position something when you have been thinking about where it is and when you might need it. And beside the gun, a white envelope, sealed. A name written on the front in handwriting that Harlan recognized from club documents he had signed with Silas Dolan 15 years ago. The name on the envelope was Sadie. Harlan stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at these two things, and felt something move through him that was not precisely fear, and was not precisely rage, but was somewhere in the geography between those two things. Something cold and old and requiring of immediate and careful response. He went back to the front room. Silas was still at the window. Ryder was watching Harlan's face and reading it with the accuracy of a man who has spent enough years in close proximity to serious situations to know what serious looks like. Harlan said, "Silas." Silas said, "What?" Harlan said, "I need you to look at me." Silas turned from the window. His arms were still crossed. His face had the defensive flatness of a man who is already aware that what is coming next is something he would prefer not to address. Harlan looked at him for a long moment, long enough that Silas understood that whatever was coming had already arrived, and that there was not going to be a way to redirect it. He said, "Tell me about the drawer." Silas said nothing. He did not ask which drawer or what drawer or why Harlan was asking about a drawer. He simply stood where he was, and the defensive flatness went out of his face and was replaced by something that Harlan had not seen on Silas Dolan's face in 40 years of knowing him. Something that looked like relief. Not the relief of a man caught doing something shameful. The relief of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time, and who has just discovered, without entirely planning for it, that he does not have to carry it alone anymore, at least not tonight. He said, "I am not going to explain it to you." Harlan said, "You do not have to explain it. I understand it. I have been sitting in this room looking at this house, and I understand it. What I need you to understand is that Sadie gave us the address of this house tonight because she is frightened for you. And she has been frightened for you for years. And she is 25 years old, and she has been doing this by herself." Silas said, "Sadie does not know about." He stopped. Harlan said, "Sadie does not know what is in the drawer. You are right. She does not. But she knows something. She knows what is in your face when she looks at you. She may not have words for it, but she knows." Silas said, "I would not do it while she might find me." Harlan said, "So you have been waiting." The room was very quiet. Outside, the snow continued. The bikes were white shapes at the curb. Silas said, "I have been waiting for things to finish on their own, for the house to be gone, for there to be nothing left that she would have to sort through or explain to anyone." Harlan said, "The house." He said, "There are tax letters. I have not opened them. I am aware of what they say without opening them. The man who bought the debt is named Marcus Holt, and in 26 days there is a court date, and the house is going to become his because I have not done anything to stop it." He said, "It is the last thing of hers. After the house is gone, there is nothing. Not even the bike. Not even the house. Nothing left that was hers. And when there is nothing left, there is no point in waiting for anything." He was not crying. He was stating facts in the voice of a man for whom these facts had become ordinary, which was in its own way worse than crying. Harlan stood up. He crossed the room and he did something he had not done in 15 years. He put his hand on Silas Dolan's shoulder and left it there. He said, "Then we are not going anywhere tonight." Silas looked at him. Some part of his face was fighting against what his eyes were doing and losing. Harlan said, "You can tell us to leave. You can tell us you do not want us here. But I am telling you now that we will sit on your porch in the snow before we drive away from this house tonight and leave you with that drawer and that envelope and a court date in 26 days. He said, "Tell us to go." Silas said nothing. He said, "Go ahead. Tell us." The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence. The kind that is not the absence of speech, but the presence of something too large for speech. Outside, the snow continued. The jukebox at Rosie's Diner was still playing. Somewhere in Montana, a storm was doing what storms do, covering everything it could find, with the same white silence. Silas Dolan stood in his dead wife's living room with his brothers around him for the first time in 15 years. And he did not tell them to go. And that was the beginning of something. Neither he nor Harlan could have said exactly what. But it was a beginning, and in the life of a man who has decided to wait for things to simply end, a beginning is not a small thing. It is everything. Harlan Crow had sat through a great many difficult nights in his 63 years on this earth. He had sat through the night that Colt's son was airlifted to the hospital in Billings, and they did not know for 11 hours whether the boy would keep his leg. He had sat through the night following the federal raid on the Missoula chapter, when the phones were ringing without stopping, and every call brought a new name and a new number attached to that name, and the number was always in years. He had sat through the night after his own mother died in the bedroom she had slept in for 50 years, and he had sat in the hallway outside that bedroom for 6 hours because he could not make himself go in. But this night had a quality to it that was different from those nights. Those nights had been about waiting for information, or waiting for outcomes, or waiting for the particular merciful moment when a bad thing becomes the past tense. This night was about something else. This night was about sitting in the presence of a man who had already made a decision and who had not yet been given a reason to unmake it. And the responsibility of that was something Harlan felt in his chest, like a second heartbeat, insistent and not entirely comfortable. He did not go back to the drawer. He did not bring it up again immediately. He sat down and he let Silas have the room for a moment the way you let a horse have the space after you first approach it, giving it time to understand that you are not a threat, even though you are also not going anywhere. Silas stood by the window for a while longer. Then he moved to the armchair in the corner, the one that was positioned slightly apart from the rest of the furniture, the one that was clearly his and had been his long enough to have taken on the shape of him. He sat in it with his feet flat on the floor and his hands on his knees, and the posture of a man who is conserving something who has been in the business of conservation for long enough that it has become automatic. Ryder had found the kitchen and come back with a pot of coffee and 5 mugs which he distributed without ceremony. Silas accepted his without comment, wrapped both hands around it, and stared at the surface of the coffee as though it contained something worth reading. The house settled around them. Old houses do this particularly in winter, the wood contracting in the cold and producing sounds that in a less inhabited space would suggest the building is alive and having opinions. This house had been doing this for 40 years. Probably had been settling and contracting and adjusting to Montana winters since before Silas Dolan and Ruth had moved into it as a young married couple, with most of their furniture bought secondhand and most of their plans made up as they went. Harlan said, "Tell me about Ruth, if you want to." Silas looked up from his coffee. Something in his expression evaluated this invitation for what it was and what it was not. He said, "What do you want to know?" Harlan said, "Whatever you want to say. I am in no hurry." Outside, the snow was still coming. Not heavy now. More like a decision than an event, the sky continuing to make the same choice it had been making since 9 o'clock, without apparent intention of reconsidering. Silas said she was not supposed to get sick. That is the thing I could never get my head around. She had never been sick. Not really sick. She exercised. She ate the way people are supposed to eat when they are trying to stay alive. She was strong in the way certain women are strong without making noise about it, the way a tree is strong. You do not notice it until you see what weather does to the ones nearby. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The diagnosis came in December. Stage 3. The oncologist sat across from us in an office that smelled like new carpet and told us in the careful language that doctors use for things they cannot fix. And Ruth sat next to me, and she was the one who held my hand. Not the other way. She held my hand, and she was the one who was sick. And she held my hand." Knox put his coffee down on the table and looked at the floor. Silas said I had 6 months before I went inside. 6 months of treatment with her, and then I was gone. 3 years. Every visit, every phone call, every letter. I could see her getting tired in a way that had nothing to do with the treatment. The kind of tired that accumulates when you are fighting something that doesn't stop. She never told me how bad it was. Not fully. She would say she was having a hard week, and then she would change the subject and ask me about what I was reading or what the food was like or some small thing that was nothing and everything at the same time. He said she was protecting me in there. She was the one who was sick, and she was protecting me from the knowing of it. Colt said she was remarkable. I only knew her for a few years before everything happened, but I knew that much. She was remarkable. Silas said yes. He said it simply. The single word carried the weight of a man who has said a thing 10,000 times in his own head and is now saying it to other people for the first time and finding that the word is smaller than what it is trying to hold. He said, "When I got out March, I drove straight from Deer Lodge to the house. I had been gone 3 years and 2 months, and I had in my head a very specific version of what coming home would look like. I had kept that version of things carefully, taken it out and looked at it and put it away again many times when the nights inside were particularly long. Coming up the driveway, Ruth at the door, the smell of the kitchen, whatever she had decided to cook because she always cooked when she was nervous or happy or both. He said she was at the door. She came out onto the porch. And when I got close enough to see her properly, I understood for the first time how much she had not been telling me. The room was very quiet. He said she had lost 25 pounds. Her hair was different. Grown back in the way it grows back after chemo. Finer, the color not quite the same. She was standing in the doorway and she was smiling, and the smile was absolutely real and absolutely hers. And she was also clearly a woman who had been fighting something for 3 years without the person she wanted beside her, and had continued fighting it after the person came back, because the fighting was by then simply what she did. He said 8 months. That is what we had. 8 months from March to November, and then she was gone. He looked at the mantelpiece, at the wedding photograph, the young Silas in the suit that did not know what to do with his shoulders, and Ruth with the laugh that was visible even frozen in time. He said, "People tell you that grief gets easier. They say it with real conviction, with the tone of people who believe what they are saying. And I do not think they are lying. I think perhaps for most people it does become something you can carry without it crushing you. But there is a version of grief that is not like that. A version that does not get easier because every day you do not have her is another day of evidence that she is not coming back. And the evidence accumulates rather than diminishing, and after 12 years the pile is very large." Knox said, "We should have been here through it." Silas said, yes. He said it without anger, which was in some ways more difficult to hear than anger would have been. Anger you can respond to. This was simply acknowledgement, the flat acknowledgement of a fact that had been true for a long time, and was still true, and for which there was no retroactive remedy. Harlan said, "What happened after she was gone? Those first months?" Silas said, "I do not remember them very well. Not specifically. I remember the funeral. I remember Sadie. She was 13 and she was trying very hard to be what she thought I needed. And she did not yet know that nobody at 13 should have to work that hard. I remember the casseroles that people brought for about 3 weeks, and then stopped. I remember the specific moment when the casseroles stopped, because it was the moment I understood that the acute phase of loss, The period when the world acknowledges your loss and brings you food was over, and what came next was just the long ordinariness of being without. He said, I called some of you after, early on. Harlan said, I know. I did not call back. I am telling you that directly because I am not going to pretend otherwise. I saw your name and I thought I will call tomorrow when I am in a better position to know what to say, and tomorrow became something else. And then enough time had passed that calling felt like it required an explanation, and I did not have one I was satisfied with. Silas said, that is an honest answer. He said it without absolution in his voice. He said, I tried calling a few times. Not many. I'm not a man who calls back a second time when the first call goes unanswered. That is a failing of mine, and I know it is a failing, but it is also just who I am. When nobody called back, I told myself that I did not need anyone. I told myself I had managed alone before, and I could manage alone now. I had managed alone during 3 years inside, and during that time, I had learned a kind of self-sufficiency that I was proud of. And that became the thing I used to explain the silence to myself. He said, self-sufficiency is a thing a man can be proud of, until it becomes the reason he is alone. Ryder was sitting forward with his forearms on his knees. He had not said much since they arrived. He had that quality of listening that some people have the quality of being present without inserting himself. And Silas had noticed it. Silas looked at him. He said, how old are you? Ryder said, 41. Silas said, you are not old enough to know what this is. Ryder said, my wife killed herself 7 years ago. I am old enough. The room went still in a different way than it had been still before. The quality of the silence changed as it does when something true and unexpected is introduced into it. Silas looked at Ryder for a long time. Ryder said, she had been struggling for years. We called it depression, because that is the word you use, but depression was just the word that sat on top of something that went much deeper than the word could reach. I did not understand it while it was happening. I thought I could fix it, because I am the kind of man who fixes things, and it never occurred to me that there are things that cannot be fixed by the kind of man who fixes things. He said, she left on a Tuesday in February. I found her in the garage. There was a note. She had taken care with the note. She was a careful person, and she was careful about that too. He looked at his hands. He said, I am telling you this, not because I want your sympathy. I am telling you this because I need you to understand that I know what is in that drawer, and I know what the envelope with Sadie's name on it means. And I know what you have been waiting for. And I need you to hear what I'm about to say from someone who is not just a brother who failed you, but from someone who has been on the other side of this. Silas said nothing. His hands were still on his knees. His face had gone to the place it went when he was hearing something he had not prepared to hear. Ryder said, she took care with the note. She was careful. She thought she had handled everything. She did not understand, and she could not have understood that there is no amount of care or handling that prepares a person who loves you for what comes after. There is no version of that morning that was going to be okay. Not for me. I have been living with that morning for 7 years, and I can tell you without hesitation that it is the thing from which nothing else fully recovers. He said, Sadie will open that envelope. You know this. Wherever you have been keeping this plan in your head somewhere in it, you know that Sadie will open that envelope and she will read what you wrote. And she will stand in whatever room she is standing in when that happens, and something will break in her that does not fix. Not fully. Not in the time she has left. Silas said I would not do it while she could find me. Ryder said, she will find the envelope. She will come to this house to check on you, the way she does, and you will not be here. And there will be the envelope. And she will be 25 years old, and she will open it, and she will spend the rest of her life wondering what she missed, what she should have done, what she should have said. I know this because I spent years asking those questions about someone else, and I can tell you that those questions do not arrive at answers. They just keep arriving. The coffee in Silas's hands had gone cold. He was not looking at Ryder anymore. He was looking at the photograph of Sadie on the mantelpiece, the one from when she was maybe 10 or 11 before the years when everything got harder. A girl with her mother's eyes and her father's jaw, laughing at something outside the frame. Harlan said Silas. Silas said, I know what you want. Harlan said, I want you to give me the gun. That is all. You do not have to do anything else tonight. You do not have to make any decisions about anything else. Just give me the gun. A long time passed. Long enough that the furnace kicked on and filled the house with the particular hum of old heating systems. The sound of a house trying to maintain itself against the cold. Silas stood up. He walked to the kitchen. Harlan heard the drawer open. He heard a sound that he identified as the cylinder of the gun being emptied. Then he heard footsteps. And Silas came back into the front room and set the gun on the coffee table in front of Harlan. He had emptied the rounds into his palm and set them on the table beside it. Neat, deliberate. Like a man who does things with care, even when the things are difficult. He went back to his chair. He sat down. He said, it has been in that drawer for 4 years. I want you to know that I have not been in an emergency for 4 years. It has been there because it made a certain kind of sense to me to have it there. And because having it there meant that I had a choice. And having a choice made the days more manageable than they would have been without one. Harlan picked up the gun and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He did not comment on this. He understood what Silas was telling him. And he understood that the telling of it required no response beyond the act of taking the gun which he had already done. He said, the letters from Holt. Can I see them? Silas gestured toward the kitchen with one hand, the gesture of a man for whom the letters had become part of the furniture present, but not something he was in the habit of looking at directly. Colt went to the kitchen and came back with a stack of envelopes, some of them still sealed. He sat down and went through them without comment, stacking them in a sequence that suggested he was organizing them by date. When he was done, he set the stack on the coffee table beside the empty space where the gun had been. He said, first notice came 11 months ago. There have been 6 total. The last one is a court date. Silas said 26 days. Colt said February 3rd. Silas said yes. He said, the house is in Ruth's name. I never changed it. I could not bring myself to change it, because changing it would have required acknowledging that she was not coming back to it. And for the first year, I was not able to do that. And then the year became 2 years. And then it became simply the way things were. And I stopped thinking about it. And the taxes piled up the way things pile up when you stop thinking about them. And Holt came along. Harlan said, do you know who Holt is? Silas said, I know what he is. He is a man who makes money identifying properties where the owner is too far gone to fight back. He is not a new kind of man. He is a very old kind of man. And he is very good at identifying who cannot fight. He said it without particular emotion. The way a man says something he has known for a long time and has stopped being angry about. Harlan said he made a mistake. Silas said, "What mistake?" Harlan said, "He identified you as someone who cannot fight. That was his mistake." Silas looked at him. He said, "You do not know what I can and cannot do anymore." Harlan said, "No. But I am going to find out." The night moved on. They did not sleep. Nobody suggested sleeping. The nature of the night made sleep beside the point, the way sleep becomes beside the point when the thing you are doing is more important than rest. They talked, not always about difficult things. Knox told a story about a run through Wyoming in 2007 that had ended with 2 flat tires in a motel that had turned out to be a front for something that the 4 of them had decided to be significantly elsewhere, from as quickly as possible. Silas almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was in that neighborhood, and Harlan noticed it the way you notice the first light before sunrise. Not the thing itself, but the evidence that it is coming. Colt talked about the charter as it was now versus how it had been the younger members, the changes, what had stayed the same and what had not. Silas asked questions, small questions. Questions that suggested he had not entirely stopped being interested in the thing, even as he had told himself he had. Around 3 in the morning, the conversation found its way back to the things that mattered. Harlan said, "You mentioned that Ruth had some things she had handled before she died. Financial things, practical things." Silas said, "She was thorough. Even at the end, she was thorough. There was a will. There was a list of accounts. There was a folder in the filing cabinet in the bedroom with everything anyone would need to know organized in alphabetical order, with a typed index at the front. That was Ruth. She would have made a better accountant than she ever made a high school English teacher. But she loved the teaching." He said, "I went through the folder once, maybe a year after. I found what was in it, and I put it back, and I did not open it again because opening it meant going through her things in a deliberate way, and I was not ready for that. And then I became someone who is never ready for anything." He said she had a life insurance policy, a small one, through the school district. I remember the number from when I read it. It was not enough to retire on, but it was not nothing. Harlan said, "When did you last look at that folder?" Silas said, 11 years. Harlan said, "Do you know if the policy was ever claimed?" The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silences before it. This was the silence of a man running a calculation he had not run before arriving at a result he had not expected to arrive at. Silas said, "I do not know. I did not claim it. It never occurred to me because money was not the thing I was thinking about. And by the time it might have occurred to me, enough time had passed that I assumed it was gone. Lapsed, whatever happens to those things when nobody tends to them." Harlan said, "Those things do not always lapse." He said it carefully, not with certainty, with the carefulness of a man who has spent 40 years paying attention to what is possible and what is not. He said, "In the morning we are going to get that folder out of the cabinet, and we are going to look at the policy and find out what the numbers are and what the timeline is, and whether there is something there that belongs to you that you have not yet claimed." Silas said, "Even if there is something there, it is probably not enough for what Holt is owed." Harlan said, "Let us find out what the number is before we decide what it is not enough for." Silas looked at him for a long moment. Something was happening in his face that was hard to name, a kind of slow reorientation. A man who has been facing in one direction for so long that turning to face another direction requires more than just the physical movement. It requires a rearranging of the internal compass that has been pointing the same way for years. He said, "Why do you care about the house?" Harlan said, "Because you care about the house. Because it is the last piece of her that is in a form you can stand in and smell and put your hand on. And because you are right that losing it would not be survivable in the way that other losses have been survivable." He said, "And because it is Ruth's house and Ruth Dolan was the best thing that ever happened to you. And she deserves better than to have her house taken by a man named Marcus Holt, who preys on people who have stopped fighting." Silas said she would have handled this herself. She would have had the folder open by now and the policy researched and the attorney called and a plan in place. She was better at the practical things than I ever was. Harlan said she sounds like she was better at a great many things. Silas said she was. She was better at most things, including knowing when I was wrong, and telling me so in a way that did not make me feel less than a man. He looked at the mantelpiece. He said she would be angry with me. For this, for all of it, she would not shout. She did not shout. She would sit down with me the way she sat down with students who were going in the wrong direction, and she would ask me questions until I answered my own problem. He said, "She always said I was smarter than I acted." Knox said she was right. Silas said most of the time, yes. The furnace cycled on again. Outside, the snow had stopped, and what was left was the absolute quiet that comes after a storm in Montana. The silence of a world that has been muffled and is now simply resting. Sadie arrived at 7:30 in the morning. She came in without knocking, which suggested that not knocking was simply how things worked in this house. The kind of arrangement that develops between a parent and a child who has been checking on that parent long enough to stop treating the arrival as a visit and start treating it as something more like a return. She stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw the four men. Her eyes went to her father first, the way eyes go to the thing they most need to assess before assessing anything else. Silas was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He looked the same as he had looked at midnight, but there was something fractionally different, something in the angle of his shoulders, and Sadie, who knew her father's shoulders the way sailors know weather, noticed it. She said, "You were here all night." Harlan said, "We were here all night." She looked at Silas. She said, "Dad." He said, "I am all right." She said, "That is an extremely low bar." He said, "I know, but this morning it is the bar I can reach." She sat down. Ryder poured her coffee without being asked, which surprised her, and she thanked him and wrapped her hands around the mug and looked at the four men around her father's kitchen table. She said, "Did something happen?" Nobody answered immediately. The silence was of the kind that answers questions while appearing not to, and Sadie was smart enough to read it. She said, "Something happened. Harlan said, your father and I talked about some things. Some of them we will keep between us for now. What I can tell you is that we are now going anywhere." She looked at her father. He said, "It is fine, Sadie. It is not the same kind of fine it has been, but it is fine." She accepted this because she had learned over years of living with the versions of fine that Silas Dolan was capable of to distinguish between the ones that were simply deflection and the ones that contained something real. This one contained something real. She could feel the difference the way you can feel a change in the weather before the sky shows it. She said, "I need to tell you something." She reached into the pocket of her jacket and took out an envelope. It was not a new envelope. It was cream-colored and had gone soft at the corners the way paper goes soft when it has been stored somewhere for a long time. The handwriting on the front was in ink that had faded slightly toward the gray end of black. She set it on the kitchen table. She said, "Mrs. Altman, from 2 doors down. She was at the diner last night, late, came in after you all left. She saw me and she said she had been meaning to bring this by for a long time. And she was sorry she had waited. She said your mother gave it to her 12 years ago and asked her to keep it, and asked her to bring it over when she saw men in Hell's Angels colors come to the house." The kitchen was absolutely still. Silas was looking at the envelope. He had not touched it. He had the look of a man who is encountering something he cannot entirely process, something that requires a kind of understanding that is not immediately available. On the front of the envelope in Ruth Dolan's handwriting were these words: "For the brothers. When you finally come back." Sadie said she knew you would leave. She told Mrs. Altman she knew, and she asked her to wait. Harlan reached across the table and picked up the envelope. He looked at Silas. He said, "Do you want me to open it?" Silas said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded once, a small movement. The movement of a man who understands that he cannot do this himself and is allowing someone else to carry the weight of it. Harlan opened the envelope with care. Inside were 2 pages, both sides covered in Ruth Dolan's handwriting. The handwriting of a woman who had spent decades writing comments in the margins of high school papers and had kept the habit of clarity even at the end. He read it silently first. All of it. He needed to do that before he could read it to anyone. He needed to understand what it was before he could be responsible for delivering it. When he finished the second page, he set it down on the table and was quiet for a moment. Then he began to read it aloud. She had written to them directly. She had addressed them as brothers the way she had called them brothers when Silas brought them around in better years, the word carrying the same warmth it had always carried in her usage. She did not reproach them for leaving. She said she understood that it was in the nature of men who lived the way they lived to retreat from grief, because grief was the one thing that their particular kind of strength had no answer for. And she had always understood this, even if it had hurt. She wrote about Silas, about what he was like before, and what she knew he would become after. She wrote about it with the clear eyes of a woman who had loved a man long enough to know his architecture completely, the solid parts and the vulnerable ones. She wrote that she knew he would fold. She did not write this critically. She wrote it the way an engineer describes a load-bearing beam that is undersized for what it will be asked to carry. A fact, not a judgment. She wrote that she had loved him for 30 years, and that 30 years of loving Silas Dolan had taught her that he was capable of things that most men were not, that he was stronger than he knew in ways that had nothing to do with the ways he thought he was strong, and that the grief would be enormous, precisely because the love had been enormous, and those two things were always exactly proportional. She wrote, "I need you to find him when the time comes. I know you will leave. I know him and I know you. And I know that the leaving is not cruelty but fear. But I need you to come back. I am asking you directly, because Silas will never ask, and Sadie is too young to know to ask, and there is no one else who can do this." The kitchen was a room where nobody breathed. Harlan turned to the second page. She had written the last section separately, a paragraph set apart from the rest, by a space written with slightly different pressure, as though she had taken a break between writing it and the paragraphs before. He read, "Silas, I know you will read this last. or someone will read it to you when you cannot read it yourself. I want you to hear this in my voice, because I am writing it in my voice. And if you close your eyes, you will be able to find it. He read, "You married me when you had nothing in your hands, and I had nothing in mine. And we built everything from that, nothing, and I have been grateful for every day of it, including the hard ones, especially the hard ones." He read, "You are going to want to follow me. I know this. You are the most stubborn man I have ever loved. And when you decide something is right, you do not easily undecide it. But I need you to hear me say this as clearly as I have ever said anything. You took me with nothing in your hands. You do not get to follow me with nothing in your hands. You have Sadie. You have brothers who are going to come back because I have asked them to, and they will. Use them. All of them. That is not weakness. That is the whole point of people." He read the last line. He read, "I will be waiting. I have always been patient. Take your time. Take a long time. The longest time you can manage. And when you get here, whenever that is, we will ride." The sound that came from Silas Dolan in the silence after that last line was a sound that Harlan Crow had never heard from him in 40 years of knowing him. It was not loud. It was almost the opposite of loud. It was the sound a man makes when something that has been held at great pressure and great cost finally gives way. A sound that seemed to come from somewhere below, language below intention, from the place in a human being where the things that cannot be said live. Sadie put her arm around her father's shoulders. She did not say anything. She simply put her arm there and stayed. Silas put his face in his hands. He cried. Not quietly, not with the controlled grief of a man managing an emotion, with the entire body, with the shoulders and the chest, and the breathing with the accumulated weight of 12 years of carried grief, finding the only exit it had ever had, and taking it. Nobody moved for a long time. The kitchen held them all in the early morning Montana light coming through the window above the sink. Pale winter light that made everything slightly less solid than it would be later. The light that makes the world seem like something that is still deciding what it wants to be. When the sound had diminished to something quieter, Silas lifted his face from his hands. His eyes were red. His face had the stripped quality of a face that has given up its defenses. The quality of a man who is standing in a room he has not been able to enter for a very long time. He looked at Harlan. He said, "She knew." Harlan said, "Yes." He said, "She wrote that 12 years ago, before any of this." Harlan said, "She knew you. She knew you better than anyone." Silas looked at the envelope on the table. He said, "She always said I was too stubborn to ask for help and too proud to accept it when offered." He said, "She also always said that was my worst quality and my best one at the same time, because it kept me alive through things that should have killed me, but it also meant I would suffer longer than necessary, once the things that I could fight could no longer be fought." He looked at his hands. He said, "I am tired of suffering longer than necessary." Harlan said, "I know." He said, "I'm going to need the folder from the bedroom, the filing cabinet, Ruth's folder." Sadie stood up. She moved down the hallway without a word. They could hear the filing cabinet open, the sound of folders being moved, and then she was back with a blue folder marked in Ruth's handwriting, with a tabbed index at the front exactly as Silas had described. He opened it. He turned to the tab marked Insurance and read the page behind it and was quiet for a moment. He said it was a 10-year policy through the district. She took it out in 2004. It would have matured in 2014. He said I never claimed it. He read further. He said there is a note here in her handwriting. She has written a phone number and the words unclaimed benefit contact, and a date that suggests she updated this note in 2011 when she would have known the end was coming. He looked up. He said she prepared this. Harlan said yes. She prepared everything she could prepare, and then she trusted the rest to us. She asked us to come back, and we failed her timeline by 12 years. But we are here now. He said, call that number tomorrow when the office is open. Find out if the benefit was escheated to the state, or if it is still held. If it was escheated, there is a process for reclaiming it. It takes time, but it is possible. Silas said, how do you know this? Harlan said, because in 42 years of leading a club, I have become acquainted with a very wide range of situations in which finding money that belongs to someone requires knowing where to look and being persistent about looking. It is not a skill I am proud of having needed to develop, but it is a skill I have. Silas almost smiled. The smile got closer this time. He said, and Holt. Harlan said, Holt is a man who has done this before. I'm going to find out how many times and in how many places and what happened in those places. That will take me a day or two. Whatever I find, it belongs to you. You decide what to do with it. Silas said, he does not know who he is dealing with. Harlan said, no, he does not. Silas looked at the folder in his hands, and then at the letter on the table, and then at Sadie sitting beside him, and then at the 4 men in his dead wife's kitchen in the Montana morning. He said, she built a fortress around me and she put the keys to it in places where I would not think to look until the time was right. Harlan said she sounds like a woman who understood her husband very well and planned accordingly. Silas said 30 years. She had 30 years to learn the floor plan. He set the folder on the table. He said, I'm going to make more coffee. He stood up and crossed to the coffee maker, and this in itself was something, this simple act of standing and moving with purpose in the direction of something. And Harlan watched him do it and did not say anything about it. Some things you do not comment on when they are happening. You simply let them be what they are and remain present while they unfold. The coffee maker began its process. The kitchen filled with the smell of fresh coffee. Outside, the Montana morning had arrived in full, and the snow on the ground reflected the light back upward so that everything was slightly luminous. The luminosity of a world after storm, cleaned and bright, and containing as all such mornings do. The quiet suggestion that what comes next is not necessarily what came before. The phone call to the insurance company took 11 minutes. Silas made it from the kitchen table on the morning of the second day with Harlan sitting across from him and a cup of coffee going cold between them. He had the blue folder open in front of him and Ruth's handwriting visible on the page, and he dialed the number she had written there in 2011 with the deliberateness of a woman who was arranging things she would not be alive to see arranged. He was on hold for 4 minutes. Then a woman's voice asked how she could help, and Silas explained the situation in the careful, flat language of a man reporting information, rather than asking for sympathy, which was the only way he knew how to discuss it. He gave Ruth's name and the policy number from the document, and the date of death, and his own name as the listed beneficiary. He was on hold again. The woman came back. She said the policy had been turned over to the Montana State Unclaimed Property Division in 2016, 4 years after Ruth's death, per state law governing unclaimed insurance benefits. She said the benefit remained claimable by the listed beneficiary at any time, without a statute of limitations. She gave him a number. She said the number was the benefit amount plus 12 years of accumulated interest as required by state law. She asked if he would like her to initiate the claim process. He said yes. He set the phone down and looked at Harlan. He said, "It is enough. With what the taxes are and the penalties, it is enough to clear it." Harlan said Ruth left you the means to save her house 12 years before you needed it. Silas looked at the blue folder. He said, "She would say she left me the means and I left it sitting in a filing cabinet for 12 years out of stubbornness and self-pity." Harlan said, "Probably. What would you say?" He said, "I would say she is right, and that I am going to spend the rest of whatever time I have being somewhat less stupid about accepting what is available to me." The claim process required documents and signatures and a waiting period that the state of Montana measured in weeks rather than days, which created a problem with the court date. Harlan spent the afternoon on his own phone. He knew people in the way that a man who has spent 42 years building relationships across the full width of human experience knows people not always in the official channels, but often adjacent to them, and one of those people was a retired county court clerk in Billings who knew the relevant procedural rules and could describe precisely what a properly filed continuance request would require and what it would buy in terms of time. The continuance request was filed the following morning by an attorney named Gerald Webb, a man in Billings that Harlan had tracked down through the retired clerk. Someone who understood the mechanics of property law without charging for more hours than were actually used. The request was granted. The court date was moved to February 21st, giving them 18 additional days. Meanwhile, Silas began to read. This was the thing that Harlan had not anticipated. He had anticipated resistance, and he had anticipated the long, slow work of bringing a man back from where Silas had been. He had not anticipated that once Silas understood the shape of the problem in front of him, once it became a concrete thing with names and numbers and a court date attached to it, something in him would simply engage. The way an old engine engages when someone who understands it finally turns the key correctly. He read the Holt letters, all 6 of them in order, carefully. He made notes on a legal pad in handwriting that was cramped and precise, and told you that the hand behind it was accustomed to working in tight spaces with limited margin for error. He asked Harlan questions, specific questions about how these types of property acquisition schemes worked, and what the typical pattern was, and where the pressure points were. And Harlan answered what he could and said plainly when he did not know. On the 3rd day, Silas drove himself to the county courthouse in Billings. He drove the truck that had been sitting in the driveway for 6 months, and it started on the 3rd try, and he sat in it for a moment. After it started in the driveway with the engine running, Harlan watched from the window and did not come outside. Silas pulled out of the driveway and drove himself to the courthouse. He was gone for 3 hours. When he came back, he had a photocopy of Marcus Holt's court filings and a piece of paper with 2 names written on it. The names were county clerks in 2 other Montana counties who had processed similar filings from Holt in the previous 4 years. He had gotten the names from a paralegal who had been willing to talk in the hallway outside the records office, which told you something about how Marcus Holt was regarded by the people who processed his paperwork. He put the paper on the table in front of Harlan and sat down. He said he has done this 11 times in 3 years, the same pattern. He acquires the tax debt quietly. He waits until the notice period is almost exhausted before filing the formal proceeding, so the owner has minimum time to respond. In 9 of the 11 cases, the owner did not appear at the proceeding, and default judgment was entered. In the other two cases, the owners appeared without attorneys and the proceedings went forward. Holt has never lost one. Harlan said, "Until now." Silas said, "Until now. If I can get the insurance claim processed in time and the debt cleared before the hearing, the underlying basis for the proceeding disappears. Holt loses the case because the debt he purchased no longer exists." He said, and separately from that, the pattern across 11 cases in 3 years is exactly the kind of thing that a county attorney's office is interested in if it is presented to them organized and documented, rather than as a complaint from one aggrieved property owner. Harlan said, "You are going to give them a file." Silas said, "I am going to give them a file. I spent 3 years in Deer Lodge in a facility that had a law library that I used extensively because reading was the only thing available to me that did not involve interacting with people I preferred not to interact with. I know how to organize documentation for presentation to a legal authority." He said it without apparent emotion, the way a man catalogs a skill he developed under circumstances he would not have chosen and has simply made his peace with. Knox, who had been listening from the corner, said, "You were doing what Ruth would have done." Silas looked at him for a moment. He said, "I am doing what Ruth left me the tools to do. She provided the resources. She provided the letter. She provided 12 years of accumulated interest on a life insurance policy that I was too paralyzed by grief to go looking for. The least I can do is use what she left." He said, "She always said I was better in motion than in stillness. That stillness made me dangerous because I had too much room to think in the wrong directions. She said I was a man who needed problems in front of him because problems gave his brain something to do besides turn on itself." He said, "She was right. She was usually right. It was irritating." He went back to work. The file took 4 days to compile. Silas worked on it at the kitchen table in the evenings, and in the early mornings and during the days, he made calls. He called the county attorney's offices in the 2 counties where Holt had operated and introduced himself as a property owner, facing a similar proceeding, and explained that he had documentation of a pattern of conduct he thought they would find interesting. Both offices asked him to send what he had. He sent it. On the 9th day, he got a call back from the county attorney in Chouteau County, a woman named Abigail Marsh, who spoke with the economy of someone who has read everything relevant before picking up the phone and wants to cover only the ground that has not already been covered. She said his documentation was thorough. She said her office had been aware of Holt for some time, but had been unable to establish the pattern necessary for a formal investigation because the individual cases taken in isolation appeared to be legitimate exercises of the debt acquisition process. She said what he had compiled with the specific timeline comparisons and the documentation of Holt's behavior in each case changed the picture considerably. She said she would be making some calls. Silas set the phone down and sat with that for a moment. Harlan had been at the table across from him. He said, "How do you feel?" Silas said, "Like I did a thing I should have done. Not proud exactly. More like correct. Like things are in the right position." Harlan said, "That will do." He said, "For now, yes." Ryder arrived on the 14th day with a trailer behind his truck. The trailer held a 2004 Harley-Davidson Fat Boy Black with chrome pipes in condition that spoke of a previous owner who had maintained it with genuine care and had been reluctant to part with it. Ryder had found it through a dealer in Billings who knew what Ryder was looking for, because Ryder had described it specifically. The same year, the same configuration, the same color that Silas had driven out of his life 8 years ago. for reasons he had given a different name to than the actual reason. Silas came out of the house when he heard the trailer. He stood on the porch and watched Ryder back it in and lower the ramp and wheel the bike out into the driveway. Ryder had not painted it, had not modified it, had not tried to make it anything other than what it was. He set it on its kickstand in the driveway and stepped back. Silas came down off the porch. He walked around the bike the way you walk around something you are trying to understand. From the outside. Before you commit to understanding it from the inside. He put his hand on the tank. He ran his thumb along the chrome of the pipe. He crouched down and looked at the engine casing and stood back up. He said, "What did you pay for it?" Ryder said, "It is not your concern." He said, "Ryder." Ryder said, "It is a gift from the brothers. It is the kind of gift that you do not argue about and do not try to repay because the accounting on it runs in a direction you cannot reverse." Silas looked at him. He said, "I am not good at those." Ryder said, "We know. Accept it anyway." Silas looked at the bike for another moment. He said, "It needs work. The front brake feels soft from standing." Ryder said, "Yes. I thought you might want to do that yourself." He said it simply, without elaboration. But they both understood what he meant by it. The understanding that passes between men who know that the doing of a thing can matter as much as the thing itself. That there are forms of healing that require the hands to do the work before the mind will accept that the work is real. Silas went and got his toolbox from the basement. It was not the toolbox from his old life, the heavy roll-around that had lived in every garage he had ever occupied. That had gone with the bike 8 years ago, or before the bike, or at some point in the years when he had been systematically removing from his environment anything that reminded him of what he had been. What remained was a basic kit, the minimum necessary, and he carried it out to the driveway and set it down beside the fat boy. His hands shook when he opened the first fastener. He was aware of this. He did not comment on it, and he did not stop. He had been a mechanic since before he was old enough to legally own the vehicles he worked on. And he understood that the hands remember things the mind has tried to forget, and that the memory lives in the muscle and the tendon, and the way a familiar tool sits in a familiar grip. He worked slowly. He made mistakes. He had to back out and reapproach a fitting 3 times before he got the angle right. He dropped a socket wrench on the driveway and it clattered on the concrete, and he watched it settle and did not say anything, just picked it up and went back to the work. An hour in Knox came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and set one beside Silas on the driveway without a word. Silas picked it up and drank from it without stopping work. Knox leaned against the truck and watched. 2 hours in the front brake was done. The fluid was fresh and the line was bled, and the feel at the lever was what it should be, firm and responsive and honest. Silas stood up. His back had opinions about 2 hours on a driveway in January, and he let those opinions register, and then moved past them. He sat on the bike. He did not start it. He just sat on it with his hands on the grips and his feet on the pegs and the weight of the thing under him. The specific and familiar weight of a fat boy at rest, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he started it. The engine turned over on the second try and settled into the idle that these engines settle into when they are warm and healthy and have been maintained with care. A sound that is less mechanical than it sounds in description. A sound that is almost biological in its rhythm, like something breathing. Silas sat on the idling bike in his driveway in January and his face did something that his face had not done in a very long time. Nothing dramatic, not a smile exactly. Something quieter and more fundamental than a smile, the expression that belongs to a person who has found their way back to something they did not know they had lost the coordinates to. He did not ride that day. He let it idle for 10 minutes and then shut it off. He went inside and made lunch for the first time in longer than he could account. For a simple thing, sandwiches, but made with the attention that you give something when the making of it is itself the point. He set plates on the table without being asked. The court date was February 21st. The insurance claim cleared on February 17th. The funds were transferred directly to the Wilson County Tax Authority at 8:45 in the morning on February 18th, 3 days before the hearing. The tax debt, all 4 years of it, including penalties and interest, was extinguished before Marcus Holt arrived at the courthouse with his attorney. Silas arrived at the courthouse at 9 in the morning with a folder under his arm, and Harlan beside him. Outside the parking lot, 31 motorcycles sat in 2 rows with their engines cold and their seats accumulating the thin February light. 31 members of the Hells Angels Montana charter who had ridden from wherever they were that morning to be present in this parking lot on this day. They were not in the courtroom. They were in the parking lot. But the parking lot was visible from the entrance to the courthouse, and Marcus Holt saw them when he arrived. And the expression on his face when he saw them was something that Harlan would remember for a long time. Holt was 54 years old and expensively dressed in the way of men who use the expense of their clothing as a form of argument. He had an attorney beside him who carried a briefcase and the manner of a man accustomed to procedural victories in county courtrooms. He stopped when he saw the motorcycles. He said something to his attorney. His attorney said something back. They went inside. The hearing was in a courtroom on the 2nd floor. It was a small room, the kind of room that county courts use for proceedings that are expected to be brief and uncontested. The judge was a woman in her late 50s named Callahan, who had the efficiency of a person who has been making decisions in small rooms for a long time and has developed a tolerance for very little that does not belong there. Silas was at the respondent's table. Gerald Webb sat beside him. Holt and his attorney were at the petitioner's table. Judge Callahan called the proceeding. Holt's attorney stood and began with the procedural history of the debt acquisition and the notice requirements that had been met, and the legal basis for the relief sought, which was transfer of title to the property at 41 Callahan Street in the name of Holt's company. He spoke with the confidence of a man who has made this argument before and found it effective, and expects to find it effective again. When he sat down, Gerald Webb stood. He said that the underlying debt that formed the basis for the petitioner's claim had been satisfied in full on February 18th of the current year, 3 days prior to this hearing. He produced the receipt from the Wilson County Tax Authority, showing zero balance on the property. He produced the bank records showing the transfer. He submitted them to the clerk. He said that in the absence of an existing debt, the petitioner had no cognizable legal interest in the property, and that the petition should be dismissed. Holt's attorney objected on procedural grounds. He cited several cases. Judge Callahan read the receipts. She asked a few questions. She read the cases the attorney had cited. She said the cases did not apply to the present facts in the way the attorney was suggesting. She dismissed the petition. Holt said something to his attorney in a low voice that Silas did not catch. His attorney said something back. Holt looked at Silas for the first time since they had entered the room. Silas looked back at him with the expression of a man who has nothing to prove in this moment, because the moment has already proven everything necessary. Holt stood to leave. Gerald Webb said, "Your Honor, Before the court adjourns, I would like to submit a referral to the county attorney's office regarding a pattern of conduct by the petitioner across 11 similar proceedings in 3 Montana counties over the past 4 years, which I believe merits review. He submitted a second folder to the clerk. Judge Callahan accepted it. She said she would forward it to the county attorney. She said the court was adjourned. Holt left quickly. His attorney followed him. Silas sat at the table for a moment after they were gone. Gerald Webb said, "How do you feel?" Silas said, "Ruth's house is still Ruth's house. I feel correct." He said it the same way he had said it 9 days ago after the call with the county attorney in Chouteau County. Correct. Not triumphant. Not relieved in the way people who have won dramatic battles feel relieved. Simply the feeling of a thing being in its proper position after being out of position for too long. They went downstairs and out into the February morning. The 31 bikers in the parking lot did not cheer. They were not the kind of men who cheered. Several of them nodded. Harlan walked over to Silas and put a hand on his shoulder for a moment. And that was the extent of the ceremony, which was exactly the right extent. Knox said, "So." Silas said, "So, the house is fine." Knox said, "And you?" Silas looked at the courthouse building for a moment. He said, "I am in progress. I think that is the most accurate thing I can say." He said it without apology and without qualification. And Knox accepted it in the spirit it was offered, which was the spirit of a true thing, said by a man who has relearned the value of saying true things. They rode back to Callahan Street in a group, 31 bikes plus one new rider on a fat boy that was his and had always been going to be his in one form or another. The way certain things are yours before you know to claim them. He had not ridden in the group before that day. He had ridden alone in the driveway and once around the block at 5 in the morning when nobody was likely to see him. Relearned something in the fumbling way of relearning. And by the time they left the courthouse parking lot, he was capable of the highway and he proved it. The sensation of riding in a group again was something he had forgotten he had stored. It was not the same as riding alone, the solitary communion between rider and road that had been his for 40 years. It was something else. The awareness of other engines around you. Other riders reading the same road through the same air. The way the group breathes together, accelerates together, reads the curves and adjusts together without discussion. The language that is not language. He had thought he would find it claustrophobic. He did not find it claustrophobic. What he found was familiar in a way that went below memory into something older. The body's memory of belonging. Sadie was at the house when they arrived. She came out onto the porch when she heard the engines and stood there with her arms crossed against the cold, watching 32 motorcycles fill the street in front of the house that still belonged to her father. Her face did not conceal what it felt, which was something that had been trying for a long time to arrive and had finally managed it. She came down off the porch and she did not say anything. She walked up to her father, still sitting on the fat boy, and she put her arms around him from the side and pressed her face against his shoulder. He put his hand on her back and held it there, and they stayed like that for a moment in the February light, with 31 brothers watching from their bikes with the respect that large men have for small moments. She said something into his shoulder that nobody else heard. He said something back that nobody else heard. Then she straightened up and wiped her face with the back of her hand, with the same efficiency she used to pull her hair back before a shift at Rosie's, and she went inside to make coffee for 32 people. What followed was the kind of afternoon that is simple to describe and hard to convey. 32 men in a house that had been a museum of one woman's life for 12 years. standing in the kitchen and the living room, and on the porch in the February cold, talking in the way that bikers talk at gatherings, which is in parts serious and in parts ridiculous, and in parts simply the maintenance of being known to other people, the work of staying real in each other's lives. Silas stood in the middle of it, and it was not comfortable, not entirely, not yet. He was out of practice with the presence of people and the sound of his own house full of voices, and he was aware of this the way you are aware of a long-healed injury when you first put weight on it again. The weight was okay. The joint held. But you noticed it. He noticed it, and he did not retreat from it. Around 4 in the afternoon, Harlan sat down beside him on the couch in the living room in the corner where nobody else was sitting, and they were quiet for a moment in the way of two men who have said most of what needed saying and are now on the other side of the saying. Harlan said, "There is something we want to do. The brothers. If you will let us." Silas said, "What is it?" Harlan said, "Ruth. We want to do something in her name. A formal thing. A program for members of the club who are struggling with grief or depression, or whatever name you want to put on the specific darkness that finds men like us when we stop being distracted by the things that used to distract us. We want to name it for her. We want to put her name on something that will be here after all of us are gone." He said, "The vote was 38-0 3 days ago. It already has a name. It already has a structure. We just need your permission to use her name." Silas was quiet for a long time. He said, "What is it called?" Harlan said, "The Ruth Dolan Memorial Brotherhood." Silas looked at the mantelpiece, at the photograph of Ruth on the back of his bike somewhere in summer, her arms around his waist, her face turned slightly toward the camera with the expression of a woman in the exact right place, at the exact right moment. He said, "She would be embarrassed." Harlan said, "Probably. She would also have already figured out how to make it work better than we have planned it." He said, "Yes. She would have had a binder with a tabbed index by now." Harlan said, "Almost certainly." Silas said, "Do it. Put her name on it. Make it work. Make it actually work, not just a thing that exists on paper. If you are going to put her name on something, make sure it is something that does what it says it does." Harlan said, "That is the intention." He said, "Then yes." He said, "She was a teacher. She spent 30 years explaining things to people who did not yet have the tools to understand them. And she never stopped believing that the tools were available to everyone, if you could find the right way to offer them. Put her name on a thing that does that. That is the right place for it." 3 weeks later, on the Saturday closest to the anniversary of Ruth's death, they rode. The memorial ride had been Harlan's idea and Sadie's planning, and the result of both was 37 motorcycles gathered at 6 in the morning on a Montana Saturday, with the temperature at 12 degrees, and the sky the particular blue that Montana produces in winter that looks painted, and possibly is a blue that seems to exist only in places where the sky is very large and the land beneath it is very serious. Silas was at the front. He had been at the front of rides before. He had been road captain for 11 years, and road captains lead. That is simply what the position requires. But this was different because the last time he had been at the front of anything was a different version of himself. And this morning he was something between the old version and whatever came next. A man in progress. Correct about some things and still working out others, and willing to be in that state without requiring it to resolve faster than it resolved. He wore his vest. Harlan had given it to him the night before. Not his old vest, which was gone, but a new one properly patched with his road captain designation restored, and beneath the Hells Angels patch on the back, a smaller patch dark fabric with gold lettering that read, Ruth Dolan Memorial Brotherhood. It was the same patch that Harlan and Knox and Colt and Ryder and 33 other members were wearing on their vests that morning. He was not wearing it because of ceremony or obligation. He was wearing it because Ruth's name on his back felt like the right weight, like something that had been missing from the architecture of the thing he wore. He did not cry when he put it on. He had done his crying. There is a finite amount of crying available to a given person, for a given loss, and you do not always know when you have reached it. But you know after the fact, when the well is simply dry, when the grief has moved from the wet part of itself to the dry part, the part that is solid and permanent and no longer liquid, but no less real. He put the vest on and he felt correct. They rode the roads he and Ruth had ridden in the years when riding had been what they did together. The roads through the Beartooth Range that Ruth had called the roads where the sky comes down to meet you. She had been accurate. The sky at that elevation does come down to meet you. It is a specific experience that has no analog on flat ground. The compression of sky and rock into something almost intimate. Something that makes you understand in a physical, rather than intellectual way that you are very small and the earth is very old. And both of those things are fine. They stopped at noon at a diner outside Laurel that had been there since 1954 and served the kind of food that had not changed since 1954 because the people who came there did not want it to change. 37 bikers in a diner in February. The woman behind the counter looked at them and then looked at the dining room and did the calculation and got out extra chairs without being asked. They ate. They talked. Several of the younger members talked to Silas directly for the first time, not because they had been avoiding him before, but because the morning's riding had produced the kind of ease that riding together produces, the ease of men who have been in the same air, moving the same direction. A young man named Jace, 28 years old and in the club for 3 years, sat beside Silas and said, I read about the Ruth Dolan program in the charter newsletter. My dad was a vet. He came back from Desert Storm, and he was never the same, and he never talked about it, and we never knew what to do. And we lost him eventually. Not the way you lose someone. The other way. He said it in the direct way that young men sometimes say very hard things, without the softening that comes from practice because they have not yet had enough practice. Silas said, I am sorry for that. The young man said I joined because my sponsor told me it was a place that held people up. I wanted to be in something like that. I'm glad the program is real now. Silas said, so am I. He said it and found that he meant it in a way that connected to something larger than the conversation he was having. Larger than the diner, and the February afternoon, and the 36 other men eating lunch around him. He meant it in the way you mean something when the saying of it confirms the thing to yourself, when the words themselves are part of how the believing happens. They rode back in the late afternoon, the light going long and golden the way it goes in Montana in February when the sun is still low enough that it hits everything at an angle. The angle that makes old things look their age, and simple things look like they have stories. Silas was still at the front. He had been at the front all day, and he was not tired of it. They came to the cemetery at 4 o'clock as they had planned to. It was a small cemetery on the east side of Billings that had been there longer than most of the city around it, and had the quality of old Montana cemeteries, which is the quality of land that has been given a permanent purpose and has settled into it without apology. The stones were a mixture of old and newer, the older ones in the dark local stone that weathers to a kind of authority over time. The newer ones in polished granite that catches light differently. Ruth's stone was polished granite. Silas had chosen it because she had mentioned once casually that she thought polished stones were more honest than rough ones, that there was something valuable about being able to see yourself in a surface clearly. He had remembered this because it was the kind of thing Ruth said that you did not always know you had stored until you needed it. He stood in front of it. The others spread out through the cemetery in the way of men who understand that a person needs space with certain things, not abandonment, but proximity at a respectful distance. The arrangement that says we are here and this is yours. He read her name, her dates. The small line below the dates that he had chosen from something she had written in the margin of a student's essay, once a line she had been fond of, a line that said what she had believed about the work of living. She taught by example. He said, "I almost did not make it here." You probably know that. You probably knew it before it happened the way you always seem to know things before they happened. He said, "The brothers came. 12 years late, but they came. I think you factored in the lateness. I think you gave yourself a buffer in your calculations because you knew us." He said, "The house is fine. Your garden is going to take some work in the spring, but the bones of it are still there. I looked at it yesterday for the first time in years. The raised beds you built are mostly sound. I think I can get 2 of the 3 back into production by April, if the weather holds." He said, "Sadie is good. She is more than good. She is the version of you that I get to keep. And that is not a small thing. I think you knew what you were leaving me when you left her." He stood with his hands in the pockets of his jeans and his vest, with Ruth's name on the back, and the February light coming down at its low, honest angle, and the sound of 36 engines cooling in the parking area behind him. He said, "I am going to take care of the things you left me, the house and the girl and the brothers. I know you set it up this way on purpose. I know the folder and the letter and Mrs. Altman and all of it was architecture. You always were better at the architecture than I was." He said, "I'm going to be slower at this than you would want. You know that already. You married a man who is slow at the emotional things, and you did it on purpose because you said the slow ones were worth it. I'm going to hold you to that." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "She is going to outlove both of us, Sadie. I thought you should know that. She already does. I think she got the best of what each of us had and combined it into something neither of us managed individually. You would be satisfied with that. I know you would." He reached into the pocket of his vest. He took out a small, folded piece of paper, the kind torn from a notepad, and he set it against the base of the stone. It was a note he had written that morning before the ride. He did not read it aloud. Some things are addressed only to the person they are addressed to, and that is the right boundary for them. He stepped back. He stood there for another minute without speaking. Then he turned and walked back toward his bike. Harlan was standing near the front of the group. When Silas reached him, Harlan held out a vest, not Silas's vest, a different one. Silas looked at it. Harlan said, "This is from the full chapter. All 38 members. The vote was taken formally in church session. It is official." The vest had the road captain patch. It had the Hells Angels patch. And it had a patch that Silas had not seen before, a small patch below the chapter designation that read, "Founding Member. Ruth Dolan Memorial Brotherhood." Silas looked at it for a moment. He said, "I am already wearing the Brotherhood patch." Harlan said, "That one is a member patch. This one is different. This one says you started something. that the thing exists because of what you went through and what you survived, and what Ruth left for you to find. Silas took the vest. He held it for a moment, and then he folded it carefully and put it across the seat of the fat boy. He said, "I will wear it on the next ride." He said, "Today I want to wear the one with her name on it." Harlan said, "That is the right answer." Silas swung his leg over the fat boy. The engine started on the first try, the way a properly maintained engine starts when you have put in the work and not taken shortcuts. He felt it settle under him, that weight and that rumble that had been part of his life for so long, that its absence had been a kind of phantom limb, something he had continued to feel even after it was gone. He looked at the road ahead of them. It ran east from the cemetery through the edge of Billings and out into the open country. The country that in Montana is never very far from anywhere. The country that is simply the world at its most basic, land and sky, and the silence that lives in the distance between them. Sadie came up beside him on a borrowed bike. She had her learner's permit, and Knox had been patient with her for 2 weeks. And what she had was not yet fluency, but it was the beginning of it, the same way every rider begins, with a respect for the machine that is partly caution and partly something older. She looked at him. She said, "Ready." He looked at her face, which was Ruth's eyes, and his jaw, and something entirely her own that belonged to no one before her. And he thought about the 30 years he and Ruth had built together, and the 12 years since, and the piece of paper he had left at the base of the stone, and the letter in his vest pocket that he carried now, because it was Ruth's voice, and he intended to keep it close for as long as he had vest pockets. He said, "Yeah." He pulled out first the way a road captain pulls out, with the authority of someone who knows where they are going, and has made the decision that the going is worth the effort. Behind him, the engines came up one after another, the sound of them building into the sound of a group in motion. 37 voices in the single language that needed no translation. The road opened ahead of them. Montana in February. The sky enormous. The light going gold at the edges of the horizon, in the specific way that February light ends. Not dramatically, but with a kind of honesty, simply becoming what comes after it, with no pretense about the transition. Silas Dolan rode. He rode the way he had ridden before everything that had happened, and the way he had not been able to ride since, with his hands loose on the grips and his body following the road, rather than fighting it with the ease that comes from a man who has been doing something for 40 years, and whose body carries the knowledge in the place below thought, below intention, in the place where the things that are truly yours live. On the handlebars in the corner of the left mirror, housing where Sadie had pressed it that morning, without saying anything, was a small decal, the kind you buy in gift shops. A simple thing, a yellow wildflower, the kind that grew in the field behind the house on Callahan Street every summer. The kind that Ruth had grown in window boxes in the years when the field had still been someone else's land. The kind that Ruth had always said was the most honest flower, because it did not need to be tended, and it grew where it wanted, and it was exactly what it appeared to be. He saw it when he mounted the bike. He had said nothing. He had left it where Sadie had put it. The road ran east into the open country, and the 37 engines behind him were the sound of something that had been broken and was not entirely fixed and would not be entirely fixed. Because the things that break us do not entirely mend. They simply become part of the structure, the places where the material is different and also sometimes stronger. He was 58 years old. He was in progress. He was on the road. Behind him, in a cemetery on the east side of Billings against the base of a polished granite stone, A small folded piece of paper held a message that said only what it needed to say, and nothing more. Because Ruth had always believed in economy, and he had learned it from her slowly. The way he learned everything, but he had learned it. The road went east. The light went gold. The engines sang.